The screaming whine of the Pratt & Whitney engine drowned out everything, as Lieutenant Harlan Moffett pushed his F-6F Hellcat into a steep dive toward the Japanese cruiser below. At 1,500 feet, the familiar popcorn pattern of anti-aircraft fire bloomed around his aircraft, tight clusters of black smoke that seemed more like annoyances than lethal threats. It was March 17th, 1944, and Task Force 58 was conducting strikes against Japanese shipping in Truk Lagoon. As flak burst harmlessly around his Hellcat, Moffett remained steady on his attack run, watching tracers stream past his cockpit without finding their mark. He released his 500-pound bomb at 800 feet, pulled up sharply, and banked away as the explosive found its target. Behind him, the Japanese cruiser erupted in flames as its ammunition magazines detonated. Not a single scratch marked his aircraft, despite flying through a storm of anti-aircraft fire that, by all rights, should have shredded his plane to pieces. Those paper guns couldn't hit a barn door, Moffett later remarked to his squadron mates upon returning to the USS Essex. I flew right through their heaviest fire, and they might as well have been throwing rocks. No one in the 15th Fighter Squadron knew that the contemptuous nickname Moffett coined that day, paper guns, would become standard terminology throughout the Pacific Theater, a derisive reference to Japanese anti-aircraft artillery that looked impressive but proved remarkably ineffective against American aircraft. Harlan Moffett had not always been so cavalier about enemy fire. Like most naval aviators in the Pacific, he had begun his combat career with healthy respect for any weapon system designed to knock him from the sky. But experience had taught him what intelligence reports confirmed. The Japanese anti-aircraft defense systems were critically flawed in design, deployment, and effectiveness. Those fatal flaws would eventually help turn the tide in the Pacific Air War, giving American pilots an advantage that would prove decisive in the campaign's bloodiest battles. Born on a small dairy farm outside Burlington, Vermont in 1920, Moffett was the third son of industrious parents who valued hard work above all else. His father, Clayton Moffett, had served briefly in the American Expeditionary Forces during the First World War, returning home with stories of flying machines that had captured young Harlan's imagination. Growing up during the Great Depression had instilled in him a deep appreciation for machinery and the ability to repair almost anything with limited resources, a talent that would later serve him well when examining captured Japanese equipment. "My father could fix anything with baling wire and determination," Moffett once wrote in a letter home. "I learned early that understanding how something works means understanding how to defeat it." This mechanical aptitude led him to study engineering for 2 years at the University of Vermont before the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Moffett enlisted in the Navy the very next day, determined to fly rather than serve on ships that might become underwater tombs. His training performance marked him as exceptional among his peers. While many cadets struggled with the complexities of aerial navigation or gunnery practice, Moffett displayed an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems and combat tactics. Instructors noted his unusual interest in enemy equipment and capabilities, while other trainees focused solely on mastering their own aircraft. Moffett devoured intelligence reports about Japanese fighters, bombers, and anti-aircraft systems. "Knowledge of your enemy's weaknesses is as important as knowledge of your own strengths," he wrote in his training journal. "A pilot who knows which way an enemy aircraft will break when pressed has already won half the battle." This philosophy extended to ground-based threats as well, and Moffett became something of an informal expert on Japanese anti-aircraft capabilities long before he faced them in combat. After receiving his wings in October 1942, Moffett was assigned to Fighter Squadron 15 aboard the Essex, one of the new Essex-class carriers that would form the backbone of American naval aviation in the Pacific. His first combat patrol came in August 1943 during raids on Marcus Island, where he observed Japanese anti-aircraft fire firsthand. Unlike some of his fellow pilots who returned from missions visibly shaken by close calls, Moffett was perplexed by what he had seen. "Their flak patterns are all wrong," he told his squadron intelligence officer after debriefing. "They're firing predetermined patterns at fixed altitudes rather than tracking our actual flight paths. It's almost as if they're following a textbook that doesn't match our tactics." This observation would prove prophetic as American pilots began to understand the fundamental deficiencies in Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine. By the time he conducted his fateful raid on Truk in March 1944, Moffett had survived more than 20 combat missions and had begun collecting detailed notes on Japanese defensive capabilities. These notes, later shared throughout naval aviation circles, would help form the basis of the paper guns narrative that eventually reached all the way to strategic planning sessions in Pearl Harbor and Washington. The Pacific Theater in 1944 presented enormous challenges for both Japanese defenders and American attackers. After the decisive American victory at Midway in June 1942 had eliminated much of Japan's carrier strength, the strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted. America's industrial might was beginning to make itself felt as new Essex-class aircraft carriers, Fletcher-class destroyers, and thousands of aircraft rolled off production lines. Operation Cartwheel, the Allied strategy to isolate and neutralize the major Japanese base at Rabaul, was well underway by early 1944. This campaign involved a series of amphibious landings and air operations throughout the Solomon Islands and along the northern coast of New Guinea. Each new American-held airfield brought more territory within range of American aircraft, creating an ever-tightening noose around Japanese strongholds. The Japanese defensive perimeter, once stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific, was steadily contracting. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the Combined Fleet, had been killed in April 1943 when his transport aircraft was ambushed by American P-38 fighters. His successor, Admiral Mineichi Koga, struggled to develop an effective strategy against growing American air power without the fleet carriers lost at Midway and in subsequent actions. Japan's defensive strategy increasingly relied on fortified island bases defended by integrated systems of coastal artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and garrison troops prepared to fight to the death. Places like Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Eniwetok became testing grounds for these defensive tactics and proving grounds for American offensive capabilities. In theory, the Japanese anti-aircraft defenses should have been formidable. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had developed several types of anti-aircraft guns before and during the war. The most common was the Type 96 25mm autocannon, a Japanese adaptation of a French Hotchkiss design. Nearly 33,000 of these weapons were produced during the war and deployed throughout the Pacific on ships and island bases. For heavier anti-aircraft work, the Japanese relied primarily on the Type 88 75mm gun, which entered service in 1928. Although considered modern at the time of its introduction, by 1944 it had fallen well behind contemporary Allied designs in terms of rate of fire, targeting capability, and effective range. The most sophisticated Japanese anti-aircraft weapon was the Type 99 88mm gun, which was based on a captured German design. However, fewer than 2,000 of these guns were produced during the war, meaning they were never available in sufficient numbers to make a significant difference in the defense of critical targets. On paper, these weapon systems seemed adequate for their intended purpose. The problem lay not just in their technical characteristics, but in how they were deployed, supplied, and operated. This is where the gap between American and Japanese capabilities became most apparent, and where the nickname paper guns found its true meaning. While American forces were developing integrated air defense systems using radar detection, central fire control, proximity-fused shells, and guns with higher rates of fire, Japanese defenses remained largely static. Their fire control systems depended primarily on optical sighting without radar assistance, making them increasingly ineffective against faster American aircraft operating at higher altitudes or employing diving attack profiles. By early 1944, American intelligence had compiled extensive reports on Japanese defensive capabilities based on combat experience and examination of captured equipment. These reports painted a picture of an enemy whose air defense doctrine had failed to evolve with changing tactical realities. The reports reached pilots like Harlan Moffett, who used this information to develop increasingly effective attack techniques that minimized exposure to what anti-aircraft fire existed. The strategic situation in the Pacific by mid-1944 heavily favored American forces. The great carrier battles had demonstrated American naval superiority, while land-based air power continued to expand its reach with each new island secured. Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive was making steady progress through the Marshall and Caroline Islands, while General Douglas MacArthur's forces were advancing along the northern coast of New Guinea. For Japanese defenders, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Critical shortages of raw materials meant that ammunition production for anti-aircraft guns was severely curtailed. Training time for gun crews was reduced as the need to rush reinforcements to threatened areas became more urgent. Maintenance of existing weapons suffered as spare parts became scarce. Most critically, Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine failed to adapt to American tactics. While American pilots constantly evolved their approach based on battlefield experience, Japanese defenders often relied on pre-war doctrines that assumed attacking aircraft would fly predictable patterns at medium altitudes. The reality of American fighters and dive bombers attacking from multiple directions, often at very low altitudes, rendered many Japanese defensive positions effectively useless. The strategic consequences of these deficiencies would become increasingly apparent as American air power methodically dismantled Japan's outer defensive perimeter, setting the stage for the decisive battles to come. Lieutenant Moffitt's first direct encounter with Japanese anti-aircraft guns came during a strike on Roy Namur in the Marshall Islands in January 1944. Flying escort for a group of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, he observed the patterns of flak bursts as the Japanese gunners tried unsuccessfully to target the American formation. "They're firing too high and too far behind us," he noted in his mission report. "Their fuse settings seem fixed rather than adjusted for our actual altitude and speed." This observation was consistent with what American intelligence had begun to suspect. Japanese anti-aircraft crews were poorly trained in leading fast-moving targets and lacked the sophisticated fire control equipment that American and British forces were increasingly employing. Moffitt's squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Frederick Vassy, had initially cautioned his pilots about the dangers of Japanese anti-aircraft fire based on pre-war assessments of their capabilities. "We expected their guns to be as good as their aircraft," Vassy later wrote in the squadron history. "We discovered quickly that this wasn't the case. Their fighters were dangerous. Their flak was more sound and fury than actual threat." This assessment was reinforced during strikes on Truk Atoll in February 1944. Operation Hailstone, as the American attack was codenamed, was intended to neutralize this major Japanese naval base that had been considered impregnable before the war. Over 2 days, American carrier aircraft conducted more than 30 strike missions against Japanese ships, aircraft, and facilities at Truk. Lieutenant Jared Rosenberger, another pilot in Moffitt's squadron, described his experience during a low-level strafing run on Eaton Island. "Their heavy guns couldn't depress enough to target us when we came in at wave-top level. The lighter guns fired plenty, but their tracers moved so slowly you could watch them coming and adjust your flight path. It was like dodging tennis balls." Intelligence officers debriefing returning pilots began to notice a pattern in their reports. Rather than speaking of Japanese anti-aircraft fire with the respect typically afforded a lethal threat, pilots increasingly described it in dismissive terms. "It looks impressive," one pilot remarked, "all those black puffs in the sky, but they're rarely where they need to be to actually hit anything." After the Truk operation, Moffitt and several other pilots with engineering backgrounds were tasked with examining gun camera footage to analyze Japanese defensive fire patterns. Their report, submitted to Commander Air Group 15, contained detailed observations about timing, spacing, and elevation of flak bursts. The conclusion was striking. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries were consistently firing at predicted positions based on outdated data rather than adjusting to actual aircraft movement. "It's as if they're fighting the last war," Moffitt wrote. "Their firing solutions might have worked against aircraft from 1940, but they're utterly ineffective against our current tactics and aircraft performance." This analysis was passed up the chain of command, and eventually incorporated into tactical briefings for pilots throughout the Pacific Theater. By March 1944, when Moffett coined the term paper guns after his strike on the Japanese cruiser, American pilots had developed a healthy disrespect for Japanese anti-aircraft capabilities. This changing perception had significant tactical implications as pilots became willing to press attacks closer and with greater persistence, knowing that the threat from ground fire was less than initially feared. "We started taking chances we wouldn't have dreamed of 6 months earlier," recalled Lieutenant Walter Paxton, a dive bomber pilot. "When you realize their aim is off by hundreds of feet and their shell fuses are unreliable, you start focusing entirely on your bombing run rather than evasive action." This confidence wasn't merely psychological, it translated into tangible combat effectiveness as American pilots delivered their ordnance with greater precision, often making multiple passes against heavily defended targets that would previously have been approached with extreme caution. By April 1944, the term paper guns had spread throughout naval aviation circles in the Pacific. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, even referenced it in an operational assessment sent to Admiral Nimitz. "Our pilots report increasing success against enemy shipping with minimal losses to anti-aircraft fire. They have taken to calling the Japanese batteries paper guns, an apt description of defenses that appear substantial on intelligence reports but prove ineffective in actual combat." The rising confidence of American aviators was noticed by Japanese defenders as well. Lieutenant Takashi Hashimoto, an anti-aircraft officer who survived the war, later wrote in his memoirs, "The Americans became increasingly bold in their attacks, where once they maintained respectful distances, by 1944, they were attacking at altitudes and angles that exposed our weapons' limitations. We could see them flying through our fire unscathed, and it devastated morale among the gun crews." As American forces pressed closer to the Japanese home islands, the disparity in anti-aircraft capabilities became even more pronounced. The limitations of Japanese anti-aircraft systems weren't merely technical, they reflected deeper problems in Japanese military doctrine, industrial capacity, and training methodologies. While American factories produced sophisticated fire control computers and proximity fuses, Japanese gun crews relied on outdated mechanical systems and timed fuses that required precise calculation to be effective. The proximity fuse, which detonated a shell when it came within lethal range of an aircraft, rather than at a predetermined altitude, gave American anti-aircraft guns an enormous advantage that the Japanese never matched. Japanese engineers were aware of these deficiencies. Naval constructor Keiji Fukuda, captured after the war, told American intelligence officers, "We knew our anti-aircraft systems were becoming obsolete by 1943, but we lacked the industrial capacity to develop and produce improved systems while also maintaining aircraft and ship production. Strategic decisions were made to prioritize offensive capabilities over defensive ones, decisions that proved disastrous as the war progressed." The limitations of Japanese anti-aircraft artillery became glaringly apparent during the battle for the Philippines in late 1944. American carrier strikes against Manila and other key bases encountered heavy defensive fire, but suffered remarkably few losses. Lieutenant Commander James Thatch, a renowned fighter tactician, noted in his action report, "The volume of fire was impressive, but its effectiveness was negligible. Our pilots have come to expect this disparity between appearance and reality when dealing with Japanese flak." The Japanese Type 96 25mm gun, their most numerous anti-aircraft weapon, exemplified the problems with their approach. Although it could fire up to 200 rounds per minute in theory, its practical rate of fire was much lower due to its small 15-round magazine that required frequent reloading. This created critical gaps in defensive fire that American pilots quickly learned to exploit. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and later served as an air defense coordinator, identified this flaw in a post-war interview. "Our smaller caliber guns required constant reloading, creating predictable patterns of fire and silence. American pilots began timing their attacks to coincide with these silent periods, negating much of our defensive capability." Another critical deficiency was the lack of effective fire control systems. While American and British forces were deploying radar-directed guns by 1943, Japanese batteries still relied primarily on optical tracking and manual calculations. This made them particularly ineffective during night operations or in poor weather conditions, precisely when American forces often chose to attack. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most capable naval air officers, later admitted, "We never solved the problem of targeting high-speed aircraft with our anti-aircraft systems. While our naval guns were reasonably effective against ships, they proved wholly inadequate against aircraft employing modern tactics. We were essentially using World War I technology against World War II threats." By 1945, the term paper guns had become so commonplace in American military parlance that it appeared in official training materials. A tactical bulletin issued to newly arriving pilots in the Pacific Theater in February 1945 stated plainly, "Japanese anti-aircraft fire, while often intense in appearance, has proven largely ineffective against aircraft employing proper evasive techniques. Veteran pilots have dubbed these paper guns due to their imposing appearance but limited lethality." The real test of Japanese anti-aircraft capabilities came during the Great Carrier Raids against the Japanese home islands, beginning in February 1945. If the defenses of the Outer Empire had been inadequate, surely the protection of the homeland itself would be more formidable. Yet even here, American pilots found the same fundamental weaknesses. Lieutenant Moffett, now a veteran with more than 60 combat missions, led a fighter sweep against airfields near Tokyo on February 17, 1945. "The volume of fire was certainly greater than anything we'd seen before," he reported after the mission, "but its accuracy remained poor. They still hadn't solved their basic problems with fire control and fuse settings." The statistics bore out this assessment. During the February strikes against Tokyo, American carrier aircraft flew more than 2,000 sorties and lost just 60 planes to all causes, including mechanical failures and operational accidents as well as enemy action. Japanese anti-aircraft fire accounted for fewer than 25 confirmed kills, a remarkably low number considering the density of defenses around the Japanese capital. As American pilots gained experience against Japanese defenses, they developed increasingly effective countermeasures. Low-level approaches, unpredictable flight patterns, coordinated suppression attacks, and precise timing all contributed to minimizing the already limited effectiveness of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces with 34 air-to-air victories, observed during the Philippines campaign, "Their guns are dangerous only if you fly straight and level at medium altitude, exactly what no experienced combat pilot would ever do. Simple evasive action is usually enough to render their fire harmless." This tactical evolution wasn't lost on Japanese defenders. Lieutenant Shinji Nakamoto, who commanded an anti-aircraft battery on Luzon, later described the frustration. "We would see the American aircraft coming and open fire with everything we had. The sky would fill with our shells, yet the planes would slip through untouched, adjust their course slightly, and continue to their targets. Our men began to lose faith in their weapons, which is a terrible thing for a soldier's morale." The growing American disregard for Japanese anti-aircraft defenses reached its apex during the Okinawa campaign in April and May 1945. Pilots operating from carriers offshore conducted repeated strikes against Japanese positions on the island, often flying multiple missions per day against the same targets. Rather than increasing caution as they became familiar with the defenses, American pilots became increasingly bold. Lieutenant Cornelius Nui, flying a TBM Avenger from USS Bennington, described this evolution in his combat diary. "First mission against the ridge fortifications, we came in high and fast, dropped our bombs, and got out quickly. By the third day, we were making multiple passes at low altitude, strafing after dropping bombs, even circling back to observe effects. Their guns were firing constantly but hitting nothing. The term paper guns never seemed more appropriate. This confidence came at a critical time. The battle for Okinawa would prove to be among the costliest of the Pacific War, with fierce Japanese resistance on the ground. American air superiority and the ineffectiveness of Japanese anti-aircraft defenses allowed carrier aircraft to provide crucial close air support to advancing Marine and Army units, breaking up counterattacks and destroying strongpoints that might otherwise have held out for days or weeks. Without our ability to press attacks home against minimal aerial opposition, the ground campaign would have been far bloodier, noted Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of amphibious forces at Okinawa. The limitations of Japanese anti-aircraft systems directly translated to saved American lives on the ground. By June 1945, American strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands was well underway. B-29 superfortresses, operating from bases in the Mariana Islands, conducted regular raids against Japanese cities and industrial targets. Even at high altitudes, where Japanese guns should have been most effective, the bombers encountered surprisingly ineffective opposition. Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell, Jr., commander of the 73rd Bomb Wing, reported after a raid on Osaka, "Japanese heavy anti-aircraft fire appears substantial in volume but poor in accuracy. Our losses to ground fire have been significantly lower than comparable operations against German targets." The disparities between Japanese and American anti-aircraft capabilities were stark by this stage of the war. American warships bristled with dual-purpose 5-inch guns directed by radar, 40mm Bofors guns in quad mounts, and 20mm Oerlikon cannons, all integrated into layered defense systems that proved devastatingly effective against Japanese aircraft, particularly during the kamikaze attacks at Okinawa. In contrast, even the newest Japanese warships lacked comparable defensive capabilities. The super battleship Yamato, sunk during Operation Tengo in April 1945, carried numerous anti-aircraft guns, but their effectiveness was severely limited by poor fire control, inadequate training, and technical deficiencies, the same paper guns that American pilots had learned to disregard throughout the Pacific campaign. The apex of Lieutenant Moffitt's experience with Japanese anti-aircraft defenses came during a strike on airfields near Kure Naval Base on July 24, 1945. Leading a division of 4 Hellcats armed with rockets and 500-pound bombs, he attacked a heavily defended airfield where intelligence indicated several kamikaze aircraft were based. "Their defenses looked formidable on the approach," he wrote in his after-action report. "At least 20 heavy guns and dozens of automatic weapons, all firing continuously as we began our attack run. 6 months earlier, I might have broken off the attack, or at least altered my approach. But experience had taught us the reality behind the impressive display." Moffitt led his division through the barrage without a single aircraft suffering significant damage. They destroyed 7 aircraft on the ground and severely damaged runway facilities, accomplishing their mission despite what appeared to be withering defensive fire. This pattern repeated itself across hundreds of similar strikes in the final months of the war. Lieutenant Kenneth Wilson, who flew with Moffitt that day, later explained the paradox of Japanese anti-aircraft fire to a war correspondent. "It's not that there's no danger, any gun can get lucky, but their systems are fundamentally flawed. The guns look impressive, sound terrifying, and fill the sky with shell bursts and tracers, but they rarely hit what they're aiming at. They're like paper tigers, frightening at first glance but harmless once you understand their nature." By August 1945, as the war drew to its dramatic close with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American air forces operated over Japan with a level of impunity that would have seemed unimaginable in 1942. The paper guns that Lieutenant Moffitt had identified in the spring of 1944 had never evolved into a truly effective defensive system. In the aftermath of the war, American technical intelligence teams examined captured Japanese anti-aircraft equipment in detail to understand why such apparently formidable defenses had proven so ineffective. Their findings confirmed what pilots like Moffitt had discovered through combat experience. Major Thomas Cleary, who led one such intelligence team, summarized their conclusions. Japanese anti-aircraft systems suffered from 4 critical deficiencies that were never adequately addressed. First, their fire control systems lacked the sophisticated computing capabilities necessary to target high-speed aircraft effectively. Second, their fusing mechanisms were unreliable, with many shells failing to detonate or detonating at incorrect altitudes. Third, Their guns had lower rates of fire than comparable Allied weapons, creating exploitable gaps in their defensive coverage. Finally, crew training deteriorated dramatically as the war progressed, with experienced personnel lost and replacements receiving increasingly abbreviated instruction. These technical assessments validated the combat experience of pilots like Harlan Moffett, whose early identification of these weaknesses had contributed to tactical developments that saved American lives and increased combat effectiveness. The term paper guns had proven to be not just a derisive nickname, but an accurate technical assessment of a fatally flawed defensive system. The legacy of Japan's anti-aircraft deficiencies extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Military analysts studying the Pacific War identified the failure to develop effective anti-aircraft systems as one of several critical technological and doctrinal shortcomings that doomed Japan's defensive strategy. Dr. Robert Harrington, a naval historian who interviewed numerous Pacific War aviators for his 1956 study of carrier operations, concluded, "The ineffectiveness of Japanese anti-aircraft fire allowed American air power to operate with increasing boldness as the war progressed. This freedom of action translated directly into greater offensive impact, allowing American forces to neutralize Japanese positions more quickly and with fewer losses than would otherwise have been possible." In this sense, the paper guns phenomenon represents one of the most consequential technical disparities of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Harlan Moffett survived the war, having flown 78 combat missions and achieved the rank of lieutenant commander by August 1945. His astute observations about Japanese defensive weaknesses, crystallized in the term paper guns, had spread throughout the American Air Forces in the Pacific and influenced tactical developments that helped secure victory. After the war, Moffett returned to Vermont and completed his engineering degree, eventually working for defense contractors developing the next generation of aircraft systems. In a 1967 interview for the Naval Institute's Oral History program, he reflected on his wartime observations. "The Japanese anti-aircraft guns taught me an important lesson about appearances versus reality. They looked fearsome enough on paper and certainly made an impressive display when firing. But their effectiveness was compromised by fundamental technical and doctrinal flaws that were never addressed. It was a lesson I carried throughout my engineering career. Never confuse an impressive display with actual performance." The term paper guns entered the lexicon of military aviation, a shorthand reference to weapon systems that appear formidable but prove ineffective in combat. It represented more than just pilots' bravado. It encapsulated a crucial tactical insight that helped shape American air operations during the decisive campaigns of the Pacific War. Japanese military analysts conducted their own post-war assessments of anti-aircraft deficiencies. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had commanded naval air defenses before becoming associated with the kamikaze program, wrote in his final report before committing suicide in August 1945, "Our anti-aircraft defenses were compromised by technical limitations we could not overcome and doctrinal rigidity we would not overcome. American pilots correctly identified these weaknesses and exploited them mercilessly." For every American pilot who returned safely from missions over Japanese territory, the derisive nickname paper guns represented not just an observation, but a life-saving insight. The term captured a crucial reality of the Pacific Air War, that the fearsome appearance of Japanese anti-aircraft fire masked fundamental weaknesses that, once understood, could be systematically exploited. As naval aviator and historian Samuel Eliot Morison would later write, "The identification of Japanese anti-aircraft weaknesses, encapsulated in the pilot's term paper guns, represents one of those crucial battlefield insights that can shift the course of campaigns. When attacking pilots no longer fear defensive fire, they can press home attacks with greater determination and precision." In this sense, Lieutenant Moffett's casual observation after his Truk mission in March 1944 may have saved countless American lives and hastened the end of the Pacific War. Today, military historians studying the Pacific Campaign recognize the paper guns phenomenon as emblematic of broader disparities between American and Japanese capabilities as the war progressed, disparities in industrial capacity, technological development, and tactical adaptation that ultimately proved decisive. Would you have recognized the fatal flaws in a weapons system that looked impressive on paper and fired with spectacular visual effects, but consistently failed to hit its targets? Like Lieutenant Moffett and his fellow pilots, would you have had the courage to test this theory in combat, flying through apparent danger, because experience had taught you it was largely illusory? Their willingness to trust their observations, rather than preconceived notions about enemy capabilities, contributed significantly to American victory in the Pacific. Comment below and share this story so others remember what tactical insight and adaptation really means, and how the gap between appearance and reality in weapons systems can determine the outcome of wars. The paper guns of Imperial Japan stand as a warning to military planners of every generation. Never mistake an impressive display for effective performance.